Welcome back to Annie Makes Art School. I'm really excited for today's session because we're going to do an introduction to oil painting, which is one of my absolute favorite mediums. It's also a medium that can be really intimidating for people when they're first starting out for a variety of reasons. So part of my goal today is to take some of the fear factor out of oil painting and to just make it be something fun that everyone has access to. I'm going to start out by going over the basic materials you're going to want to have on hand, and then we're going to do a few different mark making exercises just to get used to playing with this particular medium. From there, I'm going to do a full walkthrough where I filmed the process of painting this piece. I'm going to talk through how I used different brushes and techniques to achieve the effects in this one. The goal is less that this is a step-by-step how-to for recreating that painting, and more that it's just a visual example of how to incorporate the kind of techniques we're talking into a finished work of art. If you guys are more interested in that kind of step-by-step painting instruction, I can conceivably put something like that together. But really my goal with these sessions is less to teach you how to recreate a specific painting and more to just help give you more tools to expand your own artistic process. As always, feel free to use the timestamps in the video description if you want to jump to a specific section. And if you have questions on anything I say, please let me know in the comments and I'm more than happy to go more in depth or to clarify anything. The first and probably most obvious thing we're going to need to get started is the oil paints themselves. And this is a pretty big barrier for a lot of people when they're first starting out oil painting because they're generally not the most affordable option. There are some cheap oil paints out there, but unlike a lot of other art supplies, I found that when you reduce the price on oil paints, you tend to also significantly reduce the quality. I have a great time with a lot of very cheap acrylic paints, but whenever I've tried using super cheap oils, it has not been worth it. There are exceptions. One that I do recommend that's not too bad price point wise is Artist Loft, which is the official brand of Michaels. As you can see, this is a pretty well-worn tube. I got this in one of their beginner sets that I believe was like the primaries plus white and or black, maybe both. Particularly the red I really love. It's a bold red. It mixes well with white to create this bright kind of bubblegum pink. The pigments hold up well, and again, price point is not too bad. Aside from that, I do mostly recommend Winsor & Newton or Gamlin or other kind of comparable brands. Again, they are not the most affordable, but it's for a reason. They are quite nice paints. If you are looking to keep things affordable, one option is to, instead of reducing the quality of your paints, reduce the number of paints that you purchase. So for example, if you really want to keep it tight, you can get a single color plus white and black. Then you'll be able to do monochrome studies where you just do tints, tones, and shades with that color, but you can still get a full scale of light and dark. Another option would be to do a primary set plus white. So for example, cyan, yellow, and magenta, or red, yellow, and blue plus white. Then you're only buying 4 tubes of paint, but you're able to mix pretty much every color within those tubes. If budget is not a major concern and you're looking to have the best supplies, another thing I do recommend is having more than one type of white. The two that I used most often are, these are both Winsor & Newton, but a titanium white and a soft mixing white. The difference between these is that your titanium white is going to give you those bright, bold highlight whites versus a soft mixing white is going to give you a subtler, more blending white. Both of these really come in handy. I tend to use a soft mixing white most with things like skin tones versus my titanium white for if I'm painting a surface that I want to look like wet or I want that bright white shine on the eye. If I were painting myself right now, my glasses would definitely have some titanium white where the light is hitting them. I would say probably the number one thing that stops people from wanting to use oil paint is solvents. These are super harsh chemicals. If you're working with them, you want to make sure you have thorough ventilation, you're keeping it away from any pets or kiddos in the house, you're avoiding contact with your skin. They're just not fun to work with. This is terpenoid, which is a low odor version of turpentine, but even still, it's a very harsh chemical and I really don't like working with it. I've got it with me today so I can demonstrate how this is used because it can be very helpful in your practice to clean your brushes, to thin out your paint. But I did just want to make it clear that if this is something that's standing in the way of your oil painting, it doesn't need to. When I'm painting, I actually very rarely use solvents, and I'll talk today about some of the things that I do to get around having to deal with them at all. We're also going to want to make sure that we have linseed oil. There are other types of oils that artists regularly use, like safflower oil. If you prefer those oils, feel free to use them here. If you're not familiar with them, we'll discuss them more down the line. In this case, I've poured my linseed oil into this little glass bottle and have a palette knife I keep in there. This is so that when I'm applying my oil, instead of having to pour from the bottle and risking putting too much into it, I can take this and put just a little drop exactly where I want it. Another option is to use an eyedropper. It's the same thing. It just gives you a little bit more control when applying the oil to your canvas or to your palette and not risking having a total oil spill. The next thing we're going to want are brushes, and these come in so many sizes and shapes and price points. Today we're going to play with a few kind of staple brush types, but if you have more that you want to adventure with, that's awesome, and if you weren't able to find all the types that I discuss, it's really not the end of the world. The first category of brushes that I'm going to want us to have on hand are large and small. So these are both pretty large brushes, obviously one significantly larger than the other, but if you're working on a small canvas, this counts as pretty big. And then I also have a teeny tiny little detail brush here. These are going to be helpful for just getting a variety of line work or size and shape within what you're working on. Again, you don't have to have these exact brushes, but I suggest for today's exercise you have at least one larger one and one smaller one. Next, we're going to want a variety of brush shape. Today I'm going to discuss the round brush, square brush, chisel tip, and fan brush. These within their shapes also come in a variety of sizes. There are huge fans and tiny fans, etc. You're just going to ideally want to have one of each shape for playing around with today, and as you continue forward in your painting, usually you'll find which types of brushes most appeal to you. Next, we're going to want some adventure tools. This could be palette knives, plastic utensils, straws, anything that you think could make a fun, interesting texture within your paint. There's no right or wrong answer. We're just going to have a little experimentation in today's session. At the very least, I do suggest you have at least one palette knife or something similar. A cheap alternative to a palette knife, although these ones are quite affordable, is just those little like popsicle sticks. The craft sticks work just as well. You'll also want some absorbent materials, so I generally tend to have tissue, napkin, paper towel, something like that on hand, as well as a pile of little Q-tips for more detailed cleanup. At the end of the session, make sure that you're careful in disposing of these Q-tips, napkins, any rags that you use, because they will be quite soaked with oil and thus very flammable. Next, we're going to need a surface to work on. I'm using these little mini stretched canvases because I think they're super cute and I had a few on hand. You can work on small canvases. If you'd prefer, you can use a larger canvas. Honestly, you can work on pretty much any surface you want to, but if it's not a surface that has already been primed, make sure that you pick up some gesso so that you can cover the surface and keep the oil from just seeping into whatever you're working on. If you're working on something where you like that base surface, for example, if you've got a wood grain that you're working on top of, you can actually buy a clear gesso that will do the same effect and seal that surface while still leaving the wood visible underneath. Last but not least, we're going to want a palette to work on. I converted an IKEA Lazy Susan into my palette so it spins because I'm extra like that, but really you can go pretty simple with a palette. A nice option is if you have access to a plate of glass somewhere or any other surface like that that's not absorbent is going to work really well. The benefit of working on something like glass is as you're working along, you can scrape off the old paint pretty easily. As you can probably tell, I literally never clean my palette. I paint almost every day, and oil paints dry so slowly that I just keep reworking the surface for all eternity. Some of this paint is quite old and is dried on at this point, but I just keep building on top of it and adding more paint, and it becomes the monstrosity you see before you. If you're not going to be using turpentine, I strongly recommend that you have baby oil and dish detergent on hand. The combination of these two products will help you clean your brushes and keep them alive longer without having to use any kind of solvent. Now that we've got a handle on our materials, let's get to painting. First, I want you to choose any color that you like and whatever paintbrush you'd like to start with, and just lay down a swatch of paint on your surface. Here we're going to look at the difference between how solvents and oils impact our paint. If you're not working with solvents today, don't worry about this initial part, but if you are, take a little bit of your turpentine or turpenoid and apply it to an area of your paint swatch. What you'll see right away is that this has a thinning effect on your paint. And also, if you go back over it with a clean section of your Q-tip, it'll actually pull the paint right off the surface, effectively working as an eraser. The same effect can be achieved also with non-solvent gels that are available at most art supply stores. That's another alternative if you're just looking to keep turpentine out of your house. By comparison, when I apply the oil to the opposite end of the same swatch, while it does thin the paint out, it's not removing it from the surface, it's just spreading it over a wider area and creating more of a transparent effect. Next, if you've got a palette knife, I want you to use it to apply a thick amount of paint to an area of your surface. This doesn't need to look like anything specific, and you can play around with different colors as you please, but the goal is we want to apply a thick enough amount of paint that we can now play with using some of our other tools to remove paint to create texture on that surface. Depending on what you had available, this may be a longer section of your adventure today or a shorter one. I chose to play with using a straw and that little kind of rake tool that I had, but really there are so many different options for different surfaces we can apply to our canvas to pull paint out and create those kind of juicy textures. As you can see when we look a little closer up at the swatch that we've made, we have a variety of effects using only a single color and just playing with how we remove or spread that paint across the surface. From here, we're going to dive into playing with some of our brushes, so grab whatever ones you've got on hand and we're going to do some swatches with those as well. I'm going to start off with the round brush, which is one of my favorite brushes to work with because it's so incredibly versatile. Even when working with a larger round brush, you'll find that you can create very, very thin lines and very, very thick lines and really natural, organic, fluid movement. The main thing you're going to want to play with here is a change in pressure as you apply the brush. As we explore our different brushes today, I encourage you all to really take your time with them. Try different methods of application, different weights and lengths of stroke. Try turning the brush as it moves across the page, and just get a feel for how each of these tools is going to help you in creating the effects that you're looking for. Up next is our square brush, which is going to have a very different impact compared to our round brush. While our round brush made natural, flowing, organic shapes, our square brush is going to be much more blunt and geometric. As you play with this one, I encourage that you not only experiment with pressure and length of stroke, but also turning the brush to face different directions and seeing how this alternation between direction strokes can create a really interesting texture on your page. With all of your brushes, a rotation of the brush will create a difference in the line thickness, but each one is going to have a slightly different effect in how that change looks. Now let's dive into our chisel brush, which is one of my favorites. It's kind of a combination between the round brush and the square brush. Because of the angle of the tip of the brush, you have more fluid movement and versatility like you would with a round brush, but you still have that width and power that you would get with a square brush. As you're prepping your brushes, also play with how much oil you're mixing into your paint to create a thinner or thicker application on your canvas. Our chisel brush is an especially powerful tool for cutting a very clear, specific line. So as you play with this one, I recommend trying to trace along the line of one of the earlier swatches that you made, or similarly make a very controlled, specific shape. So you can get a sense for how turning and using different sides of this brush can give you really strong control over the line that you're making. Last but not least is our fan brush, which I truthfully did not really leave a good amount of space for on this canvas, but I took a little bit of white, and as you'll see, when I draw it across the earlier swatch in blue, it's now going to blend together and give us both a texture of white on top of that swatch, and it's going to carry the blue from the swatch down to another section of the page. I love all the textures and versatility that come with fan brushes. They're especially helpful if you're rendering fur, hair, leaves, anything organic like that. You can even lay them on top of other textures to do a very subtle, soft blending technique. Your homework for the week, should you choose to accept it, is to make an abstract piece experimenting with using all of these different brush strokes and more. I want you to try working with larger brushes and smaller brushes, all different shapes and sizes, and just seeing what kind of marks you can create on the page. I even strongly encourage you to bring in lots of those outside tools that we mentioned before, things like forks and palette knives, straws, Q-tips, anything that you can use to add or remove or change up the paint on your canvas. In this case, I've grabbed a scrap canvas that I already had some colors splashed across, and I'm going to lay my oils on top of it, just experimenting with different thicknesses of paint and different textures I can create. If you're looking for a little bonus challenge, think about how the elements that we discussed in color theory and composition still apply even when you're working in an abstract piece like this. You can choose to approach this as a simple mark-making exercise with no real meaning behind it, or you can approach it with a game plan in mind, thinking about the goal you want for your viewer in looking at this piece. Are you trying to create a composition and a color palette that's going to be soothing and pleasant to look at, or jarring and overwhelming? Do you want a sense of continuity and consistency, or do you want there to be one clear focal point on the page? All of these thoughts can help you in driving the types of marks that you're making and the way that you're applying them to your canvas. But then again, if you want to just take things one at a time, you can also just play. Because of the insanely slow drying time of oil, if there's a section that I don't like, I genuinely just wipe it back off the canvas. It's one of the really liberating things about working in this medium. When you're finished with your painting for the day, if you've chosen to go solvent-free, you're going to want to get a small container and pour in some baby oil. From there, you're going to wipe off all the excess paint that you can from your brushes onto either a rag or a napkin or paper towel. Then you're going to place each brush into the oil, making sure that you've got enough oil in the container to cover the full length of the bristles. From there, you're going to let them soak for a good long while, periodically taking them out and again wiping off any excess paint and then returning them back to the oil. After doing this for a while, eventually your brushes will start wiping pretty clear onto your surface, and from there you can take them to the sink and wash them with dish detergent to get out the remaining oil. Ta-da! Solvent-free cleanup. The last thing I'm going to do in today's session is walk you through the painting process for that small mouth study that I showed you at the beginning of the video. Feel free to follow along if you like, but as I mentioned, this is really more intended as a reference for how I'm applying these different techniques to an actual finished painting. I begin by prepping the canvas with a thin coat of blue paint. I've mixed it with a good amount of oil so that when I smooth it over with a paper towel, it's really just giving that even blue surface to work on top of. Most artists prep their canvas with some color because it's going to help build richness in the colors that you add on top of it. Oil paints blend really continuously from layer to layer, unlike acrylics which dry so fast and plasticky that oftentimes one layer completely covers up the next. From there, I mix a dark color by combining magenta and green, and using a detail brush I begin to sketch out roughly the composition of my piece. Sometimes I'll do this in advance using vine charcoal or graphite, but if I'm doing a quick and easy study, I'll usually just draw it out with the oils themselves. This is probably fairly obvious, but I feel like I should mention I've slightly sped up this footage just for the sake of time. While this clip is probably going to run about 15 minutes, the original study took about half an hour. Next, for the sake of demoing how I do sometimes use solvents, I'm going to get a little bit onto my Q-tip and use it to pull out that middle tone I've covered the canvas with, and instead show where my brightest highlights are going to be. This is one of the benefits of the way that turpentine does pull paint right off your canvas. You can use it kind of like you might use an eraser in a graphite or charcoal drawing to give yourself those bright highlights. Now I'm going to dive into what I consider the great balancing act of painting. I look at oil painting especially, but really any painting, as a constant back and forth between an extreme and its opposite. So adding light and then balancing that out with dark, and then going back to add more light and then more with dark. In this case, I'm doing the same thing with my warm and cool palettes. I started off with that really icy blue, so now I'm going in and warming up the painting by adding in reds and oranges anywhere I see them in the reference image. Generally, I try to exaggerate whatever colors I see in my reference, especially in the early underpainting stages. To me, it's always easier to start bold and pull back and neutralize, as opposed to starting neutral and timid and then trying to inject the boldness into your piece. So I just continue playing back and forth with those nice warm colors on top of that cool icy blue. Like I mentioned in our color theory videos, the combination of those cool tones mixed with those warm tones is going to have a neutralizing effect. Anytime you mix a color with its opposite on the color wheel, it's going to result in that kind of brown neutral tone. So now that I've mixed back and forth between my two opposite sides of my palette, I am starting to get a decent neutral, and I'm going to take my detail brush and load it up with one of my darker mixes to go in and start filling in some of the extreme shadows. Again, everything is a balancing act. I balanced out my cool and my warm, so now I'm going to balance out my light and dark. Here we see the importance of having a variety of brushes. At first I start applying with the detail brush and then quickly realize that's creating a texture I don't like. so I switch up to a chisel in order to get a wider application of paint onto my canvas without all the little squiggles you would get from using a detail brush. Around this stage of development in a painting, I like to do what I call the squint test, which is where I literally squint my eyes and look at the canvas and try and get a sense of what the overall impact is. When I squint at this canvas, the overall impact is a dark, blurry purple. So that tells me that if I want to lighten it up, the best choice for an extreme contrast would be yellow. Again, going back to our color theory, yellow is the exact opposite on the color wheel from purple, so using it as my highlight is going to have a real pop to it. But there are also areas that I'm going to want to brighten without having such an extreme clash. So in addition to mixing my yellow, I'm also going to mix a very light lavender and use that hand in hand with my yellow to lighten the overall effect of the piece. What you're seeing now is a real glimpse at my flawed artistic process. As I hold one Q-tip and one paintbrush simultaneously, I'm realizing that I just got my proportions wrong. I've made a nose that's too small for the mouth, especially based off the reference photo that I'm looking at. But the nice thing about oil paints is, again, that slow drying time gives us a lot of room to make adjustments. So I quickly take my brushes and re-sketch out a wider, larger nose onto my canvas, just taking the existing paint I have and pushing it to where I need it to be. Oil is a very forgiving medium in a lot of ways, and it's one of the reasons why I've grown to love it so much, because as you can see by the quick start to this painting, I'm not one for a lot of planning. One of the most important lessons I've learned in painting humans is that most of the things we consider to be white are just not. Pale skin, teeth, the whites of your eyes, all of these things have numerous undertones to them, especially when you factor in the lighting. So generally when I'm painting any of those elements, I try and think about supplementing in as much lavender, pale blues, pale pinks. Often I try to avoid yellows or greens as those can look kind of dingy or dirty, so in this case I've used that light lavender. From here, we're going to get to add in the real star of the show that I only need for a moment, but has such a fun impact, which is our fan brush. As I mentioned, these have such an impact in terms of texture, so I'm using a feather light pressure to just add that lip texture and smooth over the surface. Finally, after all these layers, I'm adding my first real application of a pure bright titanium white. I'm really using it exclusively on the lips to get the impact of that kind of shiny, wet, textured surface. Towards the end of any painting, I like to add a few pops of a truly unexpected color. In this case, I've gone with a bright minty green, and I'm going to go in and very sparingly add a few little areas of mint, just to draw the eye to different sections of the painting and add a little unexpected twist. Finally, I hold my piece up against the reference and do a last touch round of smoothing and evening out. In this lighting, the final image looked fairly purpley, but you'll see, with all of these contrasting colors blended, the final result is actually quite a neutral skin tone. And here is how that piece turned out. So at this stage, I need to let it completely dry, make sure that there are no final tweaks I want to do, and then when it's finished, I can varnish it, and I usually will paint the edges of my canvas a metallic gold. It gives it the effect of kind of almost having a frame without having to do anything extra to it. I hope that you guys found this helpful. There are endless techniques and methodologies and opinions about the world of oil painting. I could make probably a million different videos just on that subject alone. So if there's specific questions you have or subjects you'd like me to tackle within oil painting or anything else art related, please do let me know. I want to make sure I'm putting out the content that's relevant to you and your practices. Thank you so much.